coming, and tonight will be our final night of Polar Report, and I think it probably will be our best night, starting it off with a man that needs no introduction, David Barber from the University of Manitoba, who's been working in the Arctic since the early 1980s, and I first met him when he was using paragliding to do his research, and now is doing most of your research off the Amundsen, all right?
Yeah, we've kind of graduated from the paraglider to the Amundsen, so we upgraded a little bit. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, just by way of introduction for people that don't know where you've been and where you've come, how things have changed in terms of just the sea ice regime from the early 1980s to what we're seeing now.
Yeah, well, when I started my research work in the Arctic in 1981, we were looking at the sea ice and people were starting to talk about climate change, but from my perspective, there really wasn't any evidence for any change in the sea ice. So I tell people that the first 10 years of my career, there was just what I consider to be natural variability in the ice system. And when people would talk to me about climate change, I would say, well, no, I don't think so. I don't see any real change going on in the ice at all. And then as we went into the next 10 years of my career, there was quite a noticeable increase, but it wasn't an increase in the open water amount. It was an increase in the variability in the minimum extent of ice. So some years we'd have really a lot of ice left at the end of the year, and other years it would be a significant drop, and then it would oscillate way back up again the next year. So the variability in the minimum ice extent was considerable. Now that started to really trigger some things with me, because in a system like that you expect a sort of a certain range of variability, and as the system comes under stress, you usually expect that variability to increase. And that seemed to be what was happening in that second 10 years of my career, because we were getting this large oscillation in the minimum extent of sea ice. And then, of course, the last 10 years of my career, it's been a pretty significant downturn, and we've been seeing a lot of open water, and each year seems to outdo the previous one. There is variability still, but it's much smaller than it was in that middle 10 years of my career. And now I'm sort of thinking about what's going to happen in the last 10 years of my career, so I'm starting to move into that decade now.
The general impression out there is that this is all going along very smoothly, and that we're going to be able to sail through the Northwest Passage within 10 or 20 years safely, and the shipping companies will embrace it. Is that what you're seeing in your research?
Well, that's a really complicated question, because the Arctic is a big place, and there's a lot of different circulation regimes, and transportation in the Arctic and shipping in the Arctic, you go on in different locations. So one of the things that struck me recently is I was in China working with my colleagues at the Ocean University of China, and they showed me the ship cruise that they did in 2010, and they went from the Bering Strait straight north towards the pole, and they expected to go to about 78, maybe 80 degrees north, and be stopped by the multi-year, because they have an ice-reinforced vessel and they didn't expect to get too far. But in fact what happened was they were able to go all the way to the pole. They didn't go all the way to the pole because they were going to run out of fuel, but they stopped at about 88 degrees north and then took their helicopter and flew to the pole. And they were doing speeds through the ice, which we thought was summer multi-year pack ice in the Beaufort Sea, but they were doing 10, 12 knots through that ice all the way there. And this was reflective of a thing that happened with us on the Amundsen. We were in the southern Beaufort Sea the previous year, and we had a similar experience where we thought we were in multi-year ice, and in fact it was very heavily decayed, and we could do 13 knots with the Amundsen through this kind of ice. So it really opened my eyes to the fact that the high Arctic, when you think of the right across the pole, I would say that in 2010 you could have shipped across the pole. In 2011 you could do it again. And I don't think it's going to be very long before you'll be able to ship across that pole in an ice-reinforced vessel, or skirt around the northern sea route, which is open now. The Northwest Passage is a different beast altogether, and it's because of how the ice circulates in the Beaufort Sea. It's in a large circulation gyre that spins ice around in the Beaufort Sea in a counterclockwise fashion and pushes it up against the flank of the archipelago. And it piles that ice up there. And then there's another gyre that happens in the Atlantic sector, which is called the transpolar drift, and it circulates ice in the opposite direction in a clockwise fashion and spins it down and through Fram Strait. And so one of the things that I talked about today in my presentation in the sessions was these gyres and how they operate is a significant feature of how the ice is going to evolve in the future. And ironically, the amount of open water is actually creating some places where we have more ice hazards. So it's not a a direct relationship between open water, better shipping. Open water can also mean more hazards for shipping.
Where would that be? Do you know?
Yeah, well, I think we have a pretty good idea of what's going on with that now. The sort of northwest flank of the archipelago, this receives the ice that circulates in the Beaufort Gyre, and it piles up along that coast. And we were there last summer, and we were measuring multi-year ice thicknesses that were in excess of 120 feet. So this is a multi-year ice flow that is enormous, and there was lots of them like that in the area. There were also lots of tabular icebergs that were coming off the continental glacial ice, and getting entrained in the sea ice and then circulating with that sea ice. And again, sort of counterintuitively, this ice motion is speeding up. The gyre is circulating more quickly, and that's because the ice is breaking up into much smaller pieces, and it's caused by swells that enter the really rotted ice. They don't have any strength to dampen the wave field, so the wave field penetrates very far into the pack ice. We were measuring some of these swells 350 miles inside the pack ice edge, and they're still propagating, and they can break up multi-year sea ice instantaneously, like literally while you're looking at it. A giant flow of multi-year ice would get broken up into very small pieces, about half the length of the wavelength of the swells that are coming in. And so when you break these things up, it just speeds up the gyre, and that causes the ice to distribute and pull apart, and then it recirculates, and it actually comes back in up against the archipelago flank again, piling up there and making thicker multi-year ice for the next year. So it's sort of a self-feeding cycle in the Beaufort Gyre in particular.
And this is ice that's big enough to create a hazard.
But what it's doing is it's getting bigger and bigger, because each year it piles up on top of itself. So these very big multi-year features that we saw, typically a multi-year feature should be around 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 meters thick. These things were much, much thicker than that, and they were old remnants where ice had piled up on top of either ice before. You'd see a sail on the ice that would be, typically 1 or 2 meters high, and you would expect the keel to be 5 times that. That's the sort of normal ratio. But these were more like 10 to 20 times that on the keel side, so they're very, very big ridge remnants that have just, built up over time and are sitting there along that archipelago coast. And they either go through the Queen Elizabeth Islands and come down into the Northwest Passage, or they get entrained in the Beaufort Gyre and recirculate back out towards Alaska, and then come back in on the north part of the gyre and pile up against the archipelago again.
Has the Amundsen had to try to avoid some of this?
Well, actually, we take the Amundsen right into this stuff sometimes. We do it on purpose. But in the summer, this ice is very weak because it's isothermal. It has the same temperature through it. And we can actually break through very thick multi-year sea ice with the Amundsen in the summer when it's very warm. So we've broken pieces of ice that are, 14, 15 meters thick. And we would never do that in the winter because the ice is very strong in the winter, but in the summer we can do that. And so it gives us a good idea as to what it looks like, and then we instrument these flows with telemeter data, and we follow them throughout the year. It's part of our BRIA program right now.
Well, maybe for the purposes of our audience that have never been on an icebreaker, what does it sound like when you're breaking through ice that thick?
Yeah, pretty loud. It's pretty loud. And then, we've overwintered twice now with the ship, and of course in the wintertime when you're breaking ice it can be incredibly loud when you're down in the main hull of the ship. So there's still a lot of hazards that are associated with this situation. It's not a simple thing of more increase in open water, more navigability areas for ships, and simpler sailing, and simpler issues for hydrocarbon exploration companies that are putting out drill ships and stuff. There's an ironic thing that as we increase the amount of open water, we speed up the motion of the ice, and we increase these ice hazards because they're more available, they're more mobile now than they used to be. So how long this is going to last, we don't know, because it could be that this will be a period where we'll slowly decay these really large hazards, or these may become a feedback mechanism where these large hazards protect themselves along a narrow corridor along the northwest flank of the archipelago, and they continue to grow in those areas as the center part of the Arctic Ocean starts to open up and it's available for navigation. So it could be that the Northwest Passage is the very last place that opens up and is available for navigation, and you may be navigating across the pole much earlier than you would be against the islands.
Fascinating. Dave, it's always a pleasure, and thanks for dropping by.
Yeah, nice to chat with you.